Imagine a jar of olive oil that never runs out. Divine miracle or sensory illusion? Today, we're diving into the intriguing story of the multiplication of olive oil, questioning the limits of our perception and the fine line between faith and the most complex of illusions. Can science decipher the inexplicable? Where does the idea of something multiplying infinitely, defying logic and matter itself, come from? The foundation of the multiplication of olive oil isn't an isolated invention, but rather a resonance of archetypal narratives present in various cultures and spiritual traditions throughout human history. Elisha's instruction is, at first glance, paradoxical for someone who possesses so little. Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. It touches on universal fears of deprivation and the hope of miraculous overcoming. The narrative is not just an account of a unique event, but a mirror of the deepest human aspirations for security and unlimited provision. The cultural resonance of the eternal jar is a testament to our search for answers to the inexplicable, for overcoming material limitations. From this basis, we can begin to explore the roots of how we perceive and interpret events that seem to defy logic, and how the human mind is capable of constructing meaning and reality from often incomplete or ambiguous sensory data. The eternal jar thus becomes a symbol not only of divine provision but also of the complexity of human perception and our constant quest to understand the limits of the possible. The widow, in an act of faith and obedience, does exactly that. The miracle unfolds as she pours the little oil she possessed into each jar, and the flow does not cease until all the jars are filled. The biblical text concludes that the oil only stopped flowing when there were no more empty jars. She sells the oil, pays her debts, and lives on the rest with her sons. In the Western context, the most prominent of these stories is found in the Old Testament of the Bible, specifically in the book of 2 Kings, chapter 4, verses 1 to 7. The narrative is poignant and straightforward. A widow, wife of one of the prophets, finds herself in a state of abysmal despair. Her husband had died, leaving her with unsustainable debts, and the creditor was about to take her 2 sons as slaves, a common and cruel practice of the time to settle debts. In her anguish, she seeks help from Elisha, the prophet who succeeded Elijah. This story, in its essence, establishes the basis for our discussion on faith versus sensory illusion. It transcends mere reporting to become a starting point for exploring deep concepts such as scarcity versus abundance, the intervention of the inexplicable in daily life, and the very nature of provision. The narrative rests on the idea of an inexhaustible source, a resource that, for some reason, defies the natural laws of conservation of mass and energy. This is the foundation upon which perceptions, whether religious, mystical, philosophical, or rational, are built, giving rise to questions that have endured for millennia. What truly happened there? Was it an act of blind faith that moved mountains, a literal and irrefutable divine manifestation? Or is there an explanation that transcends the obvious and mysticism, perhaps related to how we perceive and interpret reality? The persistence of this narrative in the collective imagination, even in the scientific age, demonstrates the intrinsic power of the story. The idea of a resource multiplying indefinitely or being intrinsically inexhaustible isn't an isolated concept, nor is it exclusive to the story of the multiplication of olive oil. On the contrary, this notion of abundance that defies logical comprehension and the laws of finitude is a recurring and universal theme, interwoven into the fabric of various cultures, mythologies, and folklore around the globe, spanning millennia. Originating from Greek and Roman mythology, the cornucopia is often depicted as a large horn overflowing with fruits, flowers, grains, and riches. While it didn't physically multiply, its essence and the gifts it conferred were perceived as inexhaustible. as wisdom and inspiration were seen as qualities that could be shared without diminishing the source. In India, the tale of the Akshaya Patra in the epic Mahabharata is a remarkable example. Share a common and deep link with the central theme of the multiplication of olive oil, the representation of an inexhaustible source or a provision that transcends physical limitations and the logic of finitude, showing that the human mind is intrinsically predisposed to interpret phenomena of unexpected abundance in ways that align with its deepest beliefs, hopes, and needs. The perception of the extraordinary can be shaped by an intrinsic desire to overcome physical limitations and by a search for meaning in events that defy common explanation. The universality of these myths and legends suggests that the ability to see the miracle or the inexhaustible may be a fundamental characteristic of human cognition, a way to deal with the uncertainty and scarcity of the material world, projecting onto them the hope of a more generous reality. They illustrate the innate human belief in a provision that can go beyond effort, production, and material scarcity. Whether through a divine miracle, the magic of a legendary artifact, or a gift from the gods, the human mind has sought, throughout history, ways to conceive of overcoming limitation and the promise of plenty. This magical vessel, gifted by the sun god Surya to the character Draupadi, provided unlimited food to those in need, but only until Draupadi finished her own meal. It's a manifestation of abundance with a condition, yet it still defies the material logic of food production, highlighting the importance of divine provision in times of crisis. Its legend varies, but the essence remains. It's a symbol of infinite provision and prosperity. Whether it's the horn of the goat Amalthea that nursed Zeus with milk and honey, or a gift from the goddess Fortuna, the cornucopia represents the overcoming of scarcity through a continuous flow of goods. It is the materialization of a human desire for endless abundance. This universality suggests a deep, perhaps even innate, human aspiration to overcome scarcity. One of the most prominent examples in Western mythology is the cornucopia, or horn of plenty. These sources, often associated with deities or nature spirits, have seen as providing vital water to communities for centuries, even in times of extreme drought, defying evaporation and geology. The perception that the source is inexhaustible is reinforced by its persistence under adverse conditions, making them places of pilgrimage and faith. In other traditions, we find fascinating parallels. In Norse mythology, Kvasir's mead, which bestowed wisdom and poetry, was a magical resource. Furthermore, legends of magical wells and springs that never run dry are common in various cultures, especially in arid regions. These cases, though varying in their cultural guise and specific context, in the context of the multiplication of olive oil, these narratives serve as crucial parallels. To deepen our understanding of the multiplication of olive oil and go beyond a purely supernatural interpretation, it is imperative to explore the underlying laws and patterns that can influence our perception of seemingly impossible events. The central question here is, how can our mind be led to believe that something is multiplying, even if it is not physically doing so, without a direct violation of the laws of physics? Our senses, sight, hearing, touch, smell, and taste, however keen they may be, are inherently fallible and can be easily deceived. We do not perceive reality in its objective totality, but rather a subjective construction of it, elaborated by our brain from the sensory data it receives. A strong belief in the possibility of a miracle, especially in a context of despair and faith, can dramatically influence how we perceive what is happening. If the expectation is that the oil will multiply, an expectation perhaps reinforced by the authority and charisma of the prophet Elisha, a figure of spiritual power, the brain may see this multiplication, even if the raw sensory data does not completely confirm it. This is analogous to how a placebo can relieve pain or symptoms of a disease simply because the patient believes that the medicine is effective, activating internal healing mechanisms through mere expectation. The mind, in its powerful capacity for self-deception or self-suggestion, can create the experience of multiplication, making it real for the individual. The brain is a gap-filling machine, creating coherent narratives from fragmented information, but rather to influence and shape the interpretation of reality by those involved. The laws of physics would not be violated. What would be violated, or more precisely, circumvented, is our naive understanding of how our senses and expectations shape us. The multiplication would then be a perceptual phenomenon, a collective or individual illusion, but no less real in the subjective experience of those who witnessed it, generating faith, relief, and gratitude. This chapter invites us to look at the miracle not only as a supernatural event, but as an intricate interplay between objective reality, which obeys the laws of nature, and the subjectivity of human perception, which can transcend the obvious. It filters billions of bits of information every second, allowing only a small fraction to reach our consciousness. If the observer's attention is focused on a specific aspect of an event, other details, crucial for a complete understanding, may go completely unnoticed. The answer lies, in large part, in the complexity of human perception and how our brain processes and interprets sensory information. Imagine, for example, that small amounts of olive oil were added gradually and almost imperceptibly to the jar or vessels, perhaps through an ingenious mechanism, a hidden source, or even a partial pre-filling of the empty vessels. If the widow and observers were focused on the act of pouring the oil and on the expectation of the miracle, a state of high concentration and faith, perhaps even religious fervor, small additions of oil from an external or internal source, made discreetly and synchronized with the act of pouring, could go completely unnoticed. The brain, seeking coherence with the expectation of the miracle, would fill in the sensory gaps with the narrative that the oil simply did not stop flowing from the original jar, ignoring any interruptions or the actual provenance of the liquid. One of the key mechanisms is limited and selective perception. Consider the concept of imperceptible resource distribution as a possible explanation. Another factor of immense importance is the placebo effect and the power of suggestion. In this scenario, the role of faith and belief would not be to create substance out of nothing, violating the laws of physics. In this chapter, we will delve deeper into a crucial aspect of the central theme of the multiplication of olive oil. How observer bias and expectation shape our perception of extraordinary events. Cognitive psychology has extensively demonstrated that the human mind is not a blank slate that passively records reality. On the contrary, we are active constructors of our experience, and our pre-existing beliefs, hopes, fears, and expectations exert a powerful influence on what we perceive, how we interpret the events around us, and ultimately, how we remember them. In any situation where there is a strong belief or an intense hope for a specific outcome, our mind can, unconsciously, distort or even fabricate information to align with that belief. The authority and status of the prophet Elisha, a respected figure and bearer of the divine word, who instructed the widow to gather the jars, is not about denying faith or the power of belief, but about understanding how these elements intertwine with cognitive mechanisms to shape our experience of the world. The lens of belief, need, and expectation is so powerful that it can, in fact, redefine the very perceived reality, transforming an event that could have a natural or psychological explanation into an irrefutable testament to the supernatural. The observer's eye is not just a passive receiver of information, but an active and crucial participant in the construction of the miracle. Could have generated such a strong expectation that any flow of oil, even if it wasn't literally infinite or had small interruptions, would be perceived as such. The mind, in its quest for coherence and validation of the prophet's authority, would fill in the gaps in observation with the narrative of the miracle. Even if there was a minimal interruption in the oil flow, or if the volume decreased almost imperceptibly, the mind already programmed for the miracle would ignore these inconsistencies or rationalize them as part of the divine process, a pause before more oil flowed. This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias, where we tend to seek, interpret, and recall information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses, while ignoring or minimizing those that contradict them. In the case of the widow and the multiplication of olive oil, the context is one of extreme vulnerability and despair, where the only hope of salvation for her and her children lies in the divine intervention, a solution that transcends her ability to solve the problem. Under these circumstances of high emotional and spiritual tension, the human mind becomes exponentially more susceptible to interpretations that offer comfort, solution, and validation of its faith. If the olive oil flowed from a jar that seemed to fill endlessly, the widow and her children, already immersed in a state of deep faith, and with the pre-existing expectation of a miracle promised by the prophet, would be much more likely to attribute the phenomenon to an irrefutable supernatural intervention than to seek a materialistic explanation, an observational error, or a sensory illusion. The need for a miracle was so great that the mind would be prepared to see it, filtering out any data that might contradict this narrative. Beyond confirmation bias, the halo effect and suggestion may also have played a significant role. The multiplication of olive oil under this analysis becomes a fascinating case study of the intricate interaction between objective reality and subjective reality. How does the intriguing story of the multiplication of olive oil resonate and manifest in contemporary contexts in an age dominated by science and technology? The idea of miracles or phenomena that defy logic persists, but the science of perception. Magicians and illusionists are masters at exploiting the flaws, biases, and limitations of our minds to create the illusion that objects disappear, levitate, transform, or, indeed, multiply. They don't break the laws of physics. They circumvent them based on our limited understanding of reality and the way our brains process information. In a VR environment, we can interact with virtual objects that seem tangible, or watch a cup fill endlessly in a simulated scenario, or witness the materialization of objects in our physical environment through our glasses. It's an event that, centuries later, science and technology are beginning to unravel and even replicate, not as supernatural miracles, but as ingenious manipulations of our intricate perception and the cognitive biases inherent in the human mind. This chapter invites us to reflect that, while the packaging and context have changed, the human capacity to be surprised, to believe in the extraordinary, and to interpret phenomena that defy common sense remains constant, and science offers tools to understand the how, even if the why continues to be an object of faith, wonder, or mystery. This forces us to question the very nature of our reality and how easily our senses can be deceived, and our perception manipulated by controlled and carefully designed stimuli. The line between the real and the virtual becomes increasingly blurred, demonstrating the plasticity of human perception. A good magic trick involving multiplying coins, for example, doesn't create coins out of thin air, but manipulates the audience's attention, speed, distraction, and expectation to make it seem as if new coins emerge from nowhere, generating surprise and wonder. The multiplication of olive oil can be seen from this perspective, as a trick of nature or a divine illusion on a grand scale, where the magicians were the circumstances and the observer's expectations. And cognitive psychology continue to shed light on how we interpret the inexplicable, offering fascinating and, at times, surprising parallels. One of the most evident fields where apparent multiplication and a manipulation of perception are the basis of the spectacle is illusionism and magic. In a more practical and everyday scenario, the psychology of scarcity shows us how the perception of limited resources can be manipulated for commercial and social purposes. Marketing and advertising frequently create the illusion of limited-time offers, running out of stock, or exclusive editions to boost sales and create a sense of urgency and desire. This isn't literal multiplication, but a manipulation of the perception of availability and value, making consumers perceive the item as more valuable or scarce than it actually is, encouraging immediate purchase and consumption. The multiplication here is of demand, driven by the perception of artificial scarcity. Furthermore, the exponential advancement of virtual reality and augmented reality technology allows us to create worlds and experiences that feel entirely real and immersive, even if they don't exist physically. The multiplication of olive oil from this modern perspective can be seen as a precursor to these contemporary manifestations of perceptual manipulation. To conclude our deep journey into the multiplication of olive oil, an event that challenges us to ponder faith, science, and perception, it is crucial to reflect on the inherent limits of our human understanding and the vast, often unfathomable, comprehensive nature of the universe. Even with all scientific advancements, the ability to unravel perceptual illusions, and the growing understanding of the mind's mechanisms, there remains a vast array of phenomena that still transcend our complete comprehension and continue to fascinate us, stirring our curiosity and our search for meaning. What the central theme of the multiplication of olive oil reveals about our perception is that it is, by nature, intrinsically limited and profoundly interpretive. There will always be a realm of the unknown, a space for the inexplicable, and perhaps even for the transcendent. Whether through faith that transcends logic and connects us to larger dimensions of existence, or through natural phenomena not yet understood that await the next scientific revolution, the human capacity to marvel at what it doesn't understand is what drives us to explore, to question, to philosophize, and, ultimately, to expand the limits of our own perception and knowledge. Mystery, after all, is the fuel for curiosity, discovery, and the eternal human search for meaning. We are not mere passive recipients of sensory data that objectively record reality. We are, in fact, active creators of our own subjective reality, influenced by a complex web of pre-existing beliefs, expectations, emotions, past experiences, and the cultural and social context in which we are embedded. The human mind is a meaning-making machine, and often, that meaning is constructed to align with our deepest needs, with our longings for order, purpose, and, yes, for miracles. However, recognizing the possibility of a rational, psychological, or perceptual explanation for the multiplication of olive oil in no way diminishes the sense of awe and mystery that the story evokes. On the contrary, it invites us to an even greater admiration, an admiration for the complexity and ingenuity of the human brain, capable of constructing such vivid realities, and for the intricate dance between what is objectively real and what is subjectively perceived. Concepts like superposition or quantum entanglement, where particles can influence each other instantaneously, regardless of distance, in a way Einstein called spooky action at a distance, are examples of how the universe operates at levels that our mind, accustomed to classical logic and the laws of the macroscopic world, can barely grasp. These phenomena are not miracles in the religious sense, but they are inexplicable in terms of our everyday intuition and force us to expand the boundaries of what we consider possible and real. The universe, in its vastness and profundity, is full of unknowns that challenge our intuition and logic, constantly inviting us to expand our horizons of understanding. Quantum physics, for example, is a field of science that presents us with realities that defy common sense even more radically than the multiplication of olive oil. Therefore, the story of the multiplication of olive oil serves as a powerful and timeless reminder that, While we can and should seek logical and scientific explanations for the extraordinary, after all, was the multiplication of olive oil a divine miracle, a complex sensory illusion, or something that transcends both definitions? Perhaps the answer lies beyond a simple dichotomy, inviting us to a deeper reflection. This story forces us to confront how profoundly our beliefs and expectations shape the reality we perceive, and the complexity of the interaction between what is objective and what is subjective. What does this ancient narrative reveal about the limits of human perception and the inherent mystery of the universe, which continues to surprise and challenge us? Could it be that, at its core, the true multiplication lies in our inexhaustible capacity to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to find hope in scarcity, and to seek meaning where logic falls silent, keeping alive the flame of curiosity and wonder?